The morning sun painted golden streaks across the polished floors of Windsor Castle as Sergeant Major Thomas Heartfelt adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time. After 23 years of faithful service to the crown, Thomas had learned to read the subtle signs that marked each day as ordinary or extraordinary. Today felt different, though he couldn't quite place why. The castle was preparing for a small family gathering. Nothing grand or formal like the state occasions that drew worldwide attention. This was simply a quiet Sunday where several members of the royal family would come together for lunch, away from the cameras and crowds that usually followed their every move. For the staff and security team, these intimate family moments required just as much preparation, but with a gentler touch. Thomas had been assigned to the East Terrace Garden, a beautiful space overlooking the Long Walk, where the family often enjoyed their private time. The garden was Princess Catherine's favorite spot in the castle, known for its carefully tended roses and the peaceful view it offered of the ancient oak trees that had stood sentinel for centuries. Today, the weather was perfect for an outdoor gathering, with a soft breeze carrying the scent of blooming flowers through the air. As Thomas took his position near the garden entrance, he thought about how much had changed since he first began his service. Back then, he was a young man, fresh from military training, nervous about every protocol and procedure. Now, at 45, he had become one of the most trusted guards in the royal household, someone who understood that protecting the royal family meant more than just watching for physical threats. It meant being invisible when they needed privacy, professional when duty called. And surprisingly, sometimes it meant being human when the moment required it. The sound of approaching voices caught his attention. Prince William was walking down the corridor with his 3 children, their voices creating a cheerful melody that seemed to bring life to the ancient stone walls. Prince George, now 10 years old, walked beside his father with the careful posture he had learned from years of royal training, but his eyes still held the unmistakable spark of childhood curiosity that no amount of protocol could diminish. Princess Charlotte, 8 years old and full of energy, was asking her father about the paintings they passed, her questions coming so quickly that Prince William laughed as he tried to keep up with her rapid-fire inquiries. Prince Louis, the youngest at 5, was holding his father's hand and occasionally stopping to examine something that caught his attention, completely unbothered by the importance of the people around him. Thomas watched the small procession with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to notice everything while appearing to notice nothing. He had been present for countless royal moments over the years, from grand state dinners to quiet family walks, and he had developed a deep respect for how Prince William and Princess Catherine worked to give their children as normal a childhood as possible, within the constraints of their extraordinary circumstances. As the family approached the garden, Thomas stepped forward to open the ornate glass doors that led to the terrace. Prince William nodded his thanks, a simple gesture that Thomas had always appreciated about the future king. Despite his royal status, Prince William never forgot to acknowledge the people who worked to make his family's life run smoothly. "Good morning, Sergeant Major Heartfelt," Prince William said, his voice carrying the warmth that had made him so popular with both the staff and the British public. "Beautiful day for a family lunch, isn't it?" "Indeed it is, Your Royal Highness," Thomas replied, maintaining his professional demeanor while appreciating the prince's effort to make personal connections with his security team. The weather couldn't be more perfect. Prince George looked up at Thomas with the serious expression he often wore when observing the adults around him. The young prince had always been remarkably observant, something that both impressed and occasionally concerned the staff who worked with the family. He seemed to understand, even at his young age, that his life was different from other children, and he watched the world around him with an intensity that was unusual for someone so young. As the family moved into the garden, Thomas returned to his post, positioning himself where he could maintain a clear view of the area while remaining unobtrusive. The garden was designed to offer both beauty and security, with carefully planned sightlines and discreet security measures that allowed the family to relax without feeling confined. Princess Catherine arrived a few minutes later, elegant as always but clearly in her element as a mother preparing to enjoy time with her children. She was carrying a basket of art supplies, something that had become a tradition for their family gatherings. The children loved to draw and paint outdoors, and Catherine had learned that keeping their hands busy often led to the most meaningful conversations. The lunch table had been set under a large umbrella, creating a perfect spot for the family to dine while enjoying the garden views. Thomas noticed how the staff had arranged everything to feel casual and homey, despite the silver service and fine linens that marked it as unmistakably royal. As the family settled around the table, Thomas found himself thinking about his own children, grown now and living their own lives. He remembered Sunday lunches with his family when the children were young, the chaos and joy of trying to have a civilized meal while managing 3 energetic kids, watching the royal children. He was struck by how similar they seemed to any other family, despite the extraordinary circumstances that surrounded their daily lives. Prince Louis was telling an animated story about something that had happened at school, his hands gesturing wildly as he described his adventure to his amused parents. Princess Charlotte was carefully arranging her napkin and studying the elaborate table setting with the critical eye of someone who had been taught proper etiquette, but still found the whole process slightly mysterious. Prince George sat quietly, listening to his siblings with a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had always been the most serious of the 3 children, but Thomas had observed over the years that this seriousness came with a deep thoughtfulness and an unusual ability to notice things that others might miss. The young prince seemed to understand intuitively when someone needed kindness or attention, a quality that both his parents had worked to nurture. The conversation flowed easily between family news, school stories, and plans for upcoming activities. Thomas found himself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of a family gathering, the kind of normal moment that made all the complicated aspects of royal protection worthwhile. These were the times when the family could simply be themselves, when the children could be children, and the parents could focus on being mom and dad rather than Duke and Duchess. As lunch progressed, Thomas noticed that Prince George had become increasingly quiet. The young prince was still participating in the conversation, but Thomas could see that his attention kept drifting to something beyond the immediate family circle. Following George's gaze, Thomas tried to determine what had caught the boy's attention, but from his position, he couldn't see anything unusual. After the main course was finished, the children were given permission to explore the garden while their parents enjoyed coffee. This was always Thomas's favorite part of these family gatherings, watching the children discover something new in the familiar space, or invent games that made use of the garden's various features. Princess Charlotte immediately ran to the rose garden, where she began carefully examining the different blooms and trying to decide which ones would be perfect for the bouquet she planned to make for her mother. Prince Louis headed straight for the fountain, fascinated as always by the dancing water and the small fish that lived in the basin. Prince George walked more slowly, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that reminded Thomas strongly of the boy's grandfather, the king. But instead of heading to his usual favorite spot near the ancient sundial, George walked to the edge of the terrace and stood looking out toward the grounds beyond the garden. From his position, Thomas could see that the young prince was watching something in the distance, his expression thoughtful and slightly concerned. Thomas followed his gaze and spotted what had captured George's attention. An elderly gardener was working alone in a flower bed about 50 yards away, moving slowly and carefully as he tended to a section of plantings that looked like it had been damaged by the recent storm. The gardener, Thomas realized, was Mr. Albert Jennings, a man who had worked on the Windsor grounds for more than 40 years. Thomas knew Albert well from their occasional conversations during shift changes. The man was in his 70s now, but he continued to work because he loved the gardens and couldn't imagine spending his days any other way. Recently, though, Thomas had noticed that Albert moved more slowly, and he often saw the old gardener taking frequent breaks to rest his back. Prince George stood watching Albert work, and Thomas could see the wheels turning in the young boy's mind. This was the quality that had always impressed Thomas about George, his ability to notice when someone might need help or kindness, even when everyone else was busy with their own concerns. The afternoon sun was getting stronger, and Thomas could see that Albert was beginning to struggle with the heavy watering can he was using to tend the newly planted flowers. The old gardener would fill the can from a tap near the garden shed, carry it to the flower bed, water the plants, and then make the long walk back to refill it. With each trip, his steps seemed a little slower, and his breaks a little longer. Prince George watched this routine for several minutes, his young face serious with concentration. Thomas found himself wondering what the boy was thinking, but he also felt a growing sense of admiration for the child's attention to something that most adults would have overlooked. Princess Catherine called to the children, letting them know that they would be having dessert soon. Charlotte came running from the rose garden with dirt on her hands and a huge smile on her face. Louis reluctantly left his position by the fountain, already planning his return for after dessert. But Prince George remained standing at the edge of the terrace, still watching Albert work in the distance. Thomas saw Princess Catherine notice her eldest son's distraction and walk over to join him. "What are you looking at, sweetheart?" she asked, placing a gentle hand on George's shoulder. Prince George pointed toward Albert, who was once again making the slow journey back to the water tap. "That man looks tired." "Mummy," he said quietly. "He's been working very hard in the hot sun." Thomas felt a familiar warmth in his chest as he listened to this exchange. In a world where royal children could easily become focused only on their own privileges and comfort, Prince George's natural empathy continued to shine through. It was a quality that both his parents had worked hard to nurture, and moments like this showed how well they were succeeding. Princess Catherine looked where her son was pointing and immediately recognized Albert. "You're right," she said thoughtfully. "Mr. Jennings has been working in our gardens for many years, long before you were born. He loves taking care of all the beautiful flowers and trees that make Windsor so special." "Could we help him?" Prince George asked, his question innocent but filled with genuine concern. Thomas watched as Princess Catherine smiled at her son's suggestion. This was exactly the kind of moment she and Prince William hoped for, opportunities to teach their children about service and kindness in real, practical ways. "I think that's a wonderful idea," she said. "What do you think we could do to help?" Prince George thought for a moment, his young mind working through the possibilities. Thomas could see the boy considering various options, his expression serious as he tried to come up with the best way to help Albert without making the old gardener feel uncomfortable or embarrassed. The conversation between mother and son continued, but Thomas found his attention drifting to Albert himself. The old gardener had stopped for another rest, this time sitting on a small stone bench near his work area. Even from a distance, Thomas could see that the man was tired, and he made a mental note to check on Albert later, and perhaps suggest that he take a longer break or call it a day early. As Thomas watched, he realized that this moment, Prince George's quiet observation and concern for someone he had never met, represented something beautiful about the values that Prince William and Princess Catherine were instilling in their children. In a family where service to others was considered both a duty and a privilege, they were teaching their children to notice the people around them and to care about their well-being. The afternoon was unfolding into something more meaningful than anyone had expected, and Thomas found himself looking forward to seeing how Prince George's natural compassion would translate into action. In his years of service, he had learned that sometimes the smallest gestures could have the most profound impact, and he had a feeling that whatever Prince George decided to do would create one of those special moments that would be remembered long after the day was over. The stage was set for something beautiful to unfold, something that would touch the heart of everyone who witnessed it, and remind them all of the power of simple human kindness. After his conversation with his mother, Prince George stood quietly for a few more minutes, still watching Albert Jennings work in the distance. Thomas could see the young prince's mind working through something, his small hands clasped behind his back, as he observed every detail of the elderly gardener's struggle with the heavy watering equipment. Princess Catherine had returned to the table where Prince William was helping Princess Charlotte arrange the flowers she had gathered into a small bouquet. Prince Louis was back at the fountain, having convinced his father to let him sail a small paper boat he had made from his napkin. The family was relaxed and happy, enjoying the perfect afternoon weather and each other's company. But Prince George remained apart from the family activities, his attention focused entirely on Albert. Thomas watched as the boy's expression shifted from simple concern to what looked like determination. The young prince had clearly made a decision about something, though what exactly he planned to do remained a mystery to Thomas. Suddenly, Prince George turned and walked back toward the lunch table. But instead of rejoining his family's conversation, he began quietly collecting something. Thomas watched with growing curiosity as the boy carefully gathered several items from the table. A cloth napkin, a small pitcher that had been used for cream, and a plate of the delicate cucumber sandwiches that had been part of the lunch service. Princess Catherine noticed her son's activity and raised an eyebrow questioningly. But Prince George simply gave her a small smile and a look that seemed to say, "Trust me." It was an expression that Thomas had seen before, Usually just before George surprised everyone with an act of unexpected thoughtfulness. Prince George then walked over to where a member of the catering staff was clearing some of the dishes. "Excuse me," he said politely, his voice carrying the careful pronunciation he had been taught for formal situations. "Could I please have a glass of cold water and perhaps another sandwich or two?" The staff member, clearly surprised by the request but trained to accommodate any royal need, immediately prepared what the young prince had asked for. Thomas noticed that the woman was careful to include the finest china available and to arrange everything perfectly on a small tray. "Thank you very much," Prince George said graciously, accepting the tray with both hands. The weight was clearly significant for a 10-year-old, but he handled it carefully, his young face set with concentration and purpose. Thomas realized what was happening just as Prince George began walking toward the garden exit. The boy was planning to take refreshments to Albert, a gesture of kindness that was both incredibly sweet and potentially complicated from a security standpoint. Thomas found himself in the delicate position of needing to follow royal protocol, while not wanting to interfere with what was clearly a moment of genuine childhood compassion. Prince William noticed his son's movement and quickly understood the situation. "George," he called gently, "where are you going with that?" Prince George stopped and turned to face his father, the tray still balanced carefully in his small hands. "The gardener looks very tired and hot, Papa," he said simply. "I thought he might like something cool to drink, and perhaps a little something to eat." The entire family fell quiet at this explanation. Thomas could see Princess Catherine place her hand over her heart, clearly moved by her son's thoughtfulness. Prince William's expression softened into a mixture of pride and gentle concern. "That's very kind of you, George," Prince William said carefully. "But you know you can't just wander around the grounds by yourself." Prince George's face fell slightly, and for a moment Thomas thought the boy might abandon his plan. But then George straightened his shoulders and looked directly at his father with the same determined expression Thomas had seen him wear during formal events. "Could someone come with me?" Prince George asked hopefully. "I just want to make sure he's all right." Thomas felt something shift in his chest as he watched this exchange. In all his years of royal protection service, he had witnessed countless acts of royal duty and charity. He had seen elaborate ceremonies, formal charity visits, and carefully orchestrated public appearances designed to show the royal family's commitment to service. But this was different. This was a child's pure instinct to help someone, with no cameras, no publicity, and no adult prompting. Prince William looked at his son for a long moment, then glanced toward Thomas. Their eyes met, and in that brief exchange, Thomas saw a father trying to balance protecting his child with nurturing the exact qualities that would make George a good king someday. "Sergeant Major Heartwell," Prince William said formally, "would it be possible for you to escort Prince George on a brief walk around the gardens?" Thomas felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. Being asked to facilitate this act of kindness felt like more than just another security assignment. "Of course, Your Royal Highness," he replied, his voice steady despite the emotion he was feeling. "It would be my honor." Prince George's face lit up with a smile that seemed to make the entire garden brighter. "Thank you, Papa." "Thank you, Sergeant Major Heartwell." As they walked across the terrace toward the garden path that would lead them to Albert's work area, Thomas found himself seeing the familiar grounds through new eyes. Prince George walked carefully beside him, concentrating on keeping the tray level while navigating the uneven stone pathway. "Sergeant Major Heartwell," Prince George said quietly as they walked, "do you think the gardener will mind if I interrupt his work?" The question revealed the depth of the boy's consideration for others. Even in his desire to help, he was worried about potentially causing inconvenience or embarrassment. Thomas felt a surge of admiration for the young prince's sensitivity. "I think," Thomas said carefully, "that Mr. Jennings will be very touched by your thoughtfulness. People who work hard often appreciate when someone notices their efforts." Prince George nodded seriously, absorbing this wisdom. "What's his name again? I want to make sure I say it properly." "Albert Jennings," Thomas replied. "He's worked here at Windsor for more than 40 years. He's seen your grandfather grow up, and your father too." 40 years, Prince George repeated with wonder. "That's a very long time." As they approached Albert's work area, Thomas could see the elderly gardener more clearly. Albert was indeed tired, his movements slower than usual as he continued the laborious process of watering the newly planted flower bed. His weathered face showed the strain of working in the afternoon heat, and Thomas noticed that the man's shirt was damp with perspiration. Albert looked up as he heard their footsteps approaching, and his expression immediately shifted from surprise to concern as he recognized Prince George. Thomas could see the old gardener quickly trying to straighten his appearance, clearly worried about being caught in a less than perfect state in front of a member of the royal family. "Your Royal Highness," Albert said, attempting to bow while still holding the heavy watering can. His voice carried a slight tremor. Whether from exertion or nervousness, Thomas couldn't tell. Prince George stepped forward, still carefully balancing the tray. "Good afternoon, Mr. Jennings," he said with the formal politeness he had been taught, but his voice was warm and genuine. "I hope we're not disturbing your work." Albert looked confused, clearly trying to understand why a royal prince would seek him out in the middle of his daily tasks. "Not at all, Your Royal Highness. Is there something I can do for you?" Thomas watched as Prince George took a small step closer, his young face serious but kind. "Actually," the prince said, "I was wondering if there was something I could do for you." The confusion on Albert's weathered face deepened. In 40 years of royal service, he had probably never been asked such a question by a member of the family. Thomas could see the old gardener trying to process this unexpected situation. Prince George continued, his voice gentle but clear. "I noticed that you've been working very hard in the hot sun, and I thought you might be thirsty or hungry. I brought you some water and sandwiches, if you'd like them." For a moment, Albert said nothing. Thomas watched as the elderly man's eyes moved from Prince George's earnest face to the carefully arranged tray, then back again. The silence stretched on, and Thomas began to worry that Albert might be too overwhelmed to respond. Then, slowly, Albert set down the watering can and removed his gardening gloves. His hands, Thomas noticed, were trembling slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Your Royal Highness," Albert said softly, "in all my years of service here, no one has ever, that is to say." He stopped, clearly struggling to find the right words. Prince George waited patiently, his expression showing no impatience or confusion at Albert's emotional response. The boy seemed to understand instinctively that this moment was significant for the elderly gardener. "That's very kind of you, Your Royal Highness," Albert finally managed. "Very kind indeed." Thomas felt his own throat tighten as he watched Prince George carefully set the tray down on a nearby bench and begin arranging the items for Albert's convenience. The boy's movements were deliberate and thoughtful, making sure everything was within easy reach for the elderly man. "Please," Prince George said, gesturing to the bench, "sit and rest for a while. You've been working so hard." Albert looked around uncertainly, clearly torn between accepting the kindness being offered and his ingrained sense of protocol. In his 4 decades of service, he had probably never sat in the presence of royalty, let alone been served by a prince. "It's all right," Prince George said gently, seeming to sense the gardener's hesitation. "Papa says that good work deserves recognition, and your gardens are the most beautiful I've ever seen." These simple words seemed to break through Albert's reserve. Thomas watched as the elderly man's eyes filled with tears, and his weathered hands shook as he accepted the glass of water that Prince George offered him. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness," Albert whispered. "You're very kind, just like your father was at your age." Prince George's eyes widened with interest. "You knew Papa when he was little?" Albert smiled, his composure returning slightly as he found himself on more familiar ground. "Oh yes, Your Royal Highness. I taught him how to plant seeds in the children's garden when he was not much older than you are now. He used to come running through these very flower beds, much to his mother's dismay." Thomas watched as Prince George laughed delightedly at this image of his father as a mischievous child. The conversation was taking on a natural flow that seemed to put both participants at ease. "Did he really?" Prince George asked, settling himself on the grass beside the bench where Albert was now sitting and gratefully sipping the cool water. "Indeed he did," Albert continued, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to the subject. "And your grandfather too. Before him, I've watched 3 generations of your family grow up in these gardens." As Thomas observed this exchange, he found himself deeply moved by what was unfolding before him. This wasn't a formal royal visit or a choreographed charitable appearance. This was simply a child who had noticed someone who needed kindness and had acted on that impulse without thought of recognition or reward. The conversation between Prince George and Albert continued, with the boy asking thoughtful questions about the gardens and the old man sharing stories from his decades of service. Thomas noticed that Prince George listened intently to every word, treating Albert's stories with the same respect he would show to any distinguished visitor to the palace. As Albert relaxed and began to enjoy the unexpected break, Thomas could see color returning to the elderly man's face. The cool water and chance to rest in the shade were clearly exactly what he had needed, though he would never have asked for such consideration. "Mr. Jennings," Prince George said eventually, "would it be helpful if someone brought you fresh water more often when you're working on hot days like this?" Albert looked surprised by the question. "Oh, Your Royal Highness, you mustn't worry about such things. I manage just fine." But Thomas could see that Prince George wasn't satisfied with this answer. The boy had the same determined look he had worn earlier when watching Albert struggle with the heavy watering can. "Everyone deserves to be comfortable while they work," Prince George said with a seriousness that belied his years. "Your work makes Windsor beautiful for our family and for all the visitors who come here. That's very important." Thomas felt something break inside his chest as he listened to these words from a 10-year-old boy. In his years of service, he had seen many examples of royal duty and obligation. But this felt different. This felt like the beginning of the kind of leadership that could truly make a difference in the world. Albert seemed equally moved by the young prince's words. "You're going to make a fine king someday, Your Royal Highness," he said quietly, "just like your father and grandfather before you." Prince George considered this statement seriously. "I hope so," he said simply. "I want to help take care of people, like Papa and Grandpa do." The simple honesty of this statement hung in the air between them, and Thomas found himself blinking back unexpected tears. In that moment, he realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. The natural development of a future king's sense of service and compassion, unforced and genuine. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, Albert finished his refreshments and began to show signs of being ready to return to his work. But Thomas could see that the brief rest and conversation had revitalized him in a way that went beyond the simple physical refreshment. "Thank you again, Your Royal Highness," Albert said as he prepared to stand. "This has been one of the highlights of my 40 years here." Prince George smiled and stood as well, carefully gathering the empty dishes back onto the tray. "Thank you for taking care of our gardens, Mr. Jennings. They really are the most beautiful gardens in the world." As they walked back toward the main terrace, Thomas found himself struggling to maintain his professional composure. The entire interaction had lasted perhaps 20 minutes, but it had revealed something profound about the young prince's character that would stay with Thomas for the rest of his life. Prince George walked beside him quietly, once again concentrating on keeping the tray steady. But Thomas could see that the boy was thoughtful, processing the experience and its significance in his own young mind. "Sergeant Major Hartwell," Prince George said eventually, "do you think we could make sure someone checks on Mr. Jennings when it's very hot like this?" Thomas felt his heart swell with emotion at the question. "I think that's an excellent idea, Your Royal Highness. I'll speak with the head of grounds maintenance about it." "Thank you," Prince George said simply. "I don't want him to be uncomfortable." As they approached the garden terrace where the rest of the family was waiting, Thomas realized that this moment would be one he would carry with him always. In a single act of pure kindness, a 10-year-old prince had reminded him why he had chosen a life of service, and had shown him what true leadership could look like. The gentle choice that Prince George had made to notice, to care, and to act on that caring, had indeed made Thomas step back in emotion. But more than that, it had filled him with hope for the future of the monarchy and the kind of king Prince George would someday become. As Thomas and Prince George returned to the family gathering on the terrace, the afternoon light had taken on the golden quality that photographers always hope to capture during royal events. But this wasn't a formal occasion. and there were no cameras present to record what had just transpired in the gardens. Sometimes, Thomas reflected, the most meaningful moments happened when no one was watching except those who truly mattered. Princess Catherine looked up as they approached, her eyes immediately searching her son's face for clues about how the encounter had gone. What she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because her expression softened into a smile that spoke of maternal pride mixed with deep affection. "How was your walk?" she asked gently, though Thomas could tell from her tone that she already suspected it had been something special. Prince George set the tray down carefully on a side table before answering. "Mr. Jennings was very nice, Mummy. He told me stories about Papa when Papa was little and used to run through the flower beds." Prince William laughed, a sound filled with warmth and slight embarrassment. "Did he tell you about the time I accidentally trampled an entire row of prize-winning roses while chasing a butterfly?" "He didn't mention that one," Prince George replied with a grin. "But he did say you were very good at planting seeds." Thomas watched this family exchange with new eyes, seeing how naturally the conversation flowed from Prince George's act of kindness into shared family memories. There was no fanfare or special recognition of what the boy had done, just an easy acceptance that helping others was simply what members of this family did. But as the afternoon continued, Thomas noticed that something had shifted in the atmosphere around the royal gathering. The staff members who had witnessed Prince George's gesture seemed to move with a lighter step, and there was a quality of shared warmth that hadn't been there before lunch. Word of the young prince's kindness was clearly spreading through the team, not as gossip, but as something beautiful that people wanted to share. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper who had been with the royal household for nearly 30 years, approached Thomas during a quiet moment when the family was absorbed in helping Prince Louis launch his paper boats from different points around the fountain. "I heard about what young Prince George did," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "In all my years of service, I've never seen anything quite like it." Thomas nodded, finding that he still couldn't quite trust his voice to respond steadily. The memory of watching Prince George carefully arrange refreshments for Albert and the elderly gardener's overwhelming gratitude continued to play through his mind like a film he couldn't stop watching. He didn't hesitate, Thomas finally managed. He saw someone who needed help, and he just acted. No one told him to do it. No one suggested it. It came entirely from his own heart. Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. "That's the mark of true character. That is, when kindness comes naturally, without thinking about recognition or reward." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Prince George's laughter as Prince Louis's latest boat creation, which had apparently been designed more for looks than for sailing, immediately capsized and began sinking toward the bottom of the fountain. But even as Thomas turned his attention back to the family, he found himself thinking about Mrs. Henderson's words. True character. That was exactly what he had witnessed in the gardens with Albert. Not the practiced charity that royal children were taught as part of their public duties, but genuine, spontaneous compassion that couldn't be taught or rehearsed. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas noticed other small details that spoke to the impact of Prince George's gesture. When the family moved inside for tea, Princess Catherine made a point of asking about Albert's well-being and requesting that the kitchen staff prepare a thermos of cold water for him to take home. Prince William spoke quietly with the head groundskeeper about ensuring that the gardening staff had adequate shade and refreshment stations during hot weather. But perhaps most significantly, Thomas observed how Prince George's siblings had been affected by their brother's example. When Princess Charlotte noticed that one of the serving staff looked tired, she quietly offered to help clear some of the tea things. When Prince Louis saw a butterfly struggling to free itself from a spider web, he carefully helped it escape rather than simply watching it struggle. The ripple effects of one act of kindness seemed to be spreading throughout the afternoon, touching everyone who had witnessed it, either directly or through the sharing of the story. Thomas had seen this phenomenon before in his military service, how one person's courage or compassion could inspire an entire unit to rise to a higher standard. But seeing it happen through the actions of a 10-year-old child felt particularly powerful. As evening approached and the family gathering began to wind down, Thomas found himself thinking about how this day would be remembered. There would be no newspaper articles about Prince George's kindness to Albert, no official photographs to commemorate the moment. In the grand sweep of royal history, it might seem like a tiny, insignificant incident, but Thomas knew better. He had learned over his years of service that it was often these small, unguarded moments that revealed the true character of the people he was sworn to protect, and what he had seen today had filled him with hope for the future of the monarchy in a way that no amount of formal training or public ceremony ever could. The sound of approaching footsteps drew Thomas from his thoughts. Prince George was walking toward him, having apparently separated himself from his family's conversation for a moment. The boy approached with the same serious expression he had worn earlier when watching Albert work. "Sergeant Major Hartwell," Prince George said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for helping me visit Mr. Jennings today." Thomas felt his throat tighten again at the young prince's formal politeness, combined with genuine gratitude. "It was my pleasure, Your Royal Highness. Thank you for allowing me to accompany you." Prince George nodded seriously, then looked toward the gardens where Albert had been working. "Do you think he'll be all right?" He looked very tired. The continued concern in the boy's voice spoke to something deep and enduring in his character. This wasn't a passing moment of childhood sympathy that would be forgotten by bedtime. Prince George was genuinely worried about Albert's well-being, and that concern was clearly going to stay with him. "I believe he'll be fine," Thomas assured him. "And I think your visit meant more to him than you might realize. Sometimes, when people work very hard without much recognition, just knowing that someone notices and cares makes all the difference." Prince George considered this thoughtfully. "Will you really speak to the groundskeeper about making sure the gardeners have water when it's hot?" "I will," Thomas promised. "And I'll make sure to check on Mr. Jennings personally from time to time." "I will. I will. I will. I will." Thomas promised personally from time to time. A smile broke across Prince George's face, transforming his serious expression into something radiant. "Thank you. That makes me very happy." As Prince George returned to his family, Thomas found himself thinking about the conversations that would happen later that evening in the staff quarters. Albert's story would be told and retold, not because it was dramatic or unusual, but because it had reminded everyone of something important about why they had chosen lives of service. Thomas could imagine Albert at home that evening, telling his wife about the unexpected visit from Prince George. He could picture the elderly gardener's face as he described how a 10-year-old prince had noticed his fatigue and cared enough to bring him refreshments and conversation. The story would probably become a treasured family memory, something Albert would tell his grandchildren and great-grandchildren for years to come. But the impact wouldn't end there. Thomas knew that Albert would return to work the next day, with renewed energy and pride in his position. The other gardening staff would hear the story and feel a new sense of dignity in their roles. The entire grounds crew would understand that their work was not just noticed but appreciated by the family they served. As the royal family prepared to leave the garden, Thomas watched Princess Catherine place a gentle hand on Prince George's shoulder as they walked. He couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see the pride and love in her expression as she listened to whatever her son was telling her. Prince William was holding Prince Louis's hand, while pointing out various features of the garden, clearly using the opportunity to teach his youngest son about the history and importance of the grounds they called home. This, Thomas realized, was how true leadership was developed. Not through speeches or formal lessons about duty and responsibility, but through example and experience. Prince George had learned about service today not because anyone had lectured him about it, but because he had been given the freedom to follow his natural instincts toward kindness and had seen the positive impact of his actions. The family's departure from the garden marked the end of what had seemed like an ordinary Sunday afternoon, but as Thomas took his final look around the terrace where they had spent the day, he knew that nothing about this afternoon had been ordinary. Sometimes the most extraordinary moments came disguised as simple family gatherings, and sometimes the most powerful leadership lessons happened during unguarded moments between a child and an elderly gardener. Later that evening, as Thomas completed his shift and prepared to head home to his own family, he found himself stopping by the grounds maintenance office to speak with the head groundskeeper, just as he had promised Prince George he would. The conversation was brief but effective. Within a week, new shade stations and water coolers would be installed throughout the gardens, and a rotation system would be implemented to ensure that no one worked alone in extreme heat for extended periods. The changes were small in the grand scheme of castle operations, but they represented something much larger. the direct impact of one child's compassion on the working conditions of dozens of people. Thomas knew that Prince George would probably never know about these specific improvements, but that wasn't the point. The point was that his instinct to help had created a ripple effect that would continue to benefit people long after he had forgotten the details of this particular afternoon. As Thomas finally headed home, he found himself thinking about his own children and grandchildren, and about the stories he would tell them about his years of royal service. Today had given him a new story, one that would help him explain why he had chosen to dedicate his career to protecting and serving this particular family. It wasn't because of their wealth, or their castles, or their formal ceremonies. It was because of moments like today, when a 10-year-old prince had noticed an elderly gardener struggling in the heat and had decided, without prompting or reward, to do something about it. It was because of the hope that such moments gave him for the future of the monarchy and for the kind of leader Prince George would eventually become. The next morning, Thomas returned to his duties with a renewed sense of purpose. As he passed through the gardens on his way to his assignment, he noticed Albert working near the same flower bed where Prince George had found him the day before. The elderly gardener looked up and waved, his face breaking into a smile that seemed to light up the entire garden. "Good morning, Sergeant Major Heartwell," Albert called out. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Thomas smiled back, noting that Albert's step seemed lighter and his movements more energetic than they had been the previous afternoon. "Indeed it is, Mr. Jennings. Indeed it is." As Thomas continued toward his post, he carried with him the memory of Prince George's gentle choice and its profound impact on everyone who had witnessed it. In a world that often seemed to value grand gestures and public recognition, it had been a quiet reminder that the most powerful acts of leadership often happened when no one was watching, and that the greatest strength could be found in the simple decision to notice and care about the well-being of others. The story of that afternoon would live on in the hearts and memories of everyone who had been touched by it, a testament to the enduring power of kindness and the hope it offered for the future. And somewhere in the castle, a young prince continued to grow and learn, carrying within him the natural compassion that would someday make him not just a king, but a leader worthy of the trust his people would place in him. In the end, that was what true royalty looked like. Not the crowns or ceremonies or formal protocols, but the quiet moments when privilege was transformed into service, and when power was used to lift up those who needed it most. Prince George had spoken without saying a word, and his message had been heard by everyone who mattered. His gentle choice had indeed made the royal guard and everyone else who witnessed it step back in emotion, reminded once again of the simple, profound truth that kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change the world.